Chapter 1. Whispers in the Snow. The snow had begun to fall again, a quiet descent of white that muffled the world. The small mountain town of Ashbourne lay still under its heavy blanket, its narrow streets deserted and its windows dark. The storm had passed, but the quiet was no less oppressive. It was a silence that stretched beyond mere weather, a silence that seeped into the bones of anyone who stayed too long, a silence that spoke of things best left forgotten. Lena Crenshaw's car struggled against the unplowed road, its tires spinning and slipping. The vehicle groaned as she pressed forward, determined not to lose momentum. She hadn't driven all this way, through winding mountain passes and desolate highways, to turn back now. Her breath fogged the windshield, and she wiped it with her gloved hand, peering ahead into the swirling snow. Somewhere in this forgotten place was the story that could save her career. The cathedral came into view first, a looming silhouette against the whiteout, its spire piercing the sky like a jagged claw. It was grander than Lena had imagined, a stark contrast to the humble cottages that dotted the landscape. Its blackened stone walls and broken stained glass windows hinted at a history both opulent and tragic. It was no wonder the townsfolk avoided it. It seemed less a place of worship and more a monument to despair. The inn was easy to miss, a squat building huddled against the wind. Lena parked and stepped out, her boots crunching against the snow. The air was sharp and cold, biting at her face as she adjusted her scarf. The door to the inn creaked as she pushed it open, and the warmth inside hit her like a wave. A single oil lamp burned on the counter, its flame flickering in the draft. She didn't linger long. The innkeeper had been curt, handing her the key to her room with a muttered warning about staying away from the cathedral after dark. Lena hadn't asked why. She already knew. The story of the missing choir was etched into the town's folklore, a chilling tale of how the voices of 27 singers had been silenced in a single night. No bodies, no blood, just an empty cathedral and hymnals left open to a song that no one recognized. Once she had settled in her room, Lena retrieved her notebook and began to sketch out her plan. She had brought everything she thought she might need: her camera, a flashlight, and a digital recorder. The cathedral was the centerpiece of the story, and she planned to explore it as thoroughly as possible. But first, she wanted to familiarize herself with the town. Ashbourne was smaller than she'd imagined, its streets winding in labyrinthine patterns that seemed designed to confuse outsiders. The buildings were old, their stone facades weathered by time and neglect. She passed a general store with its windows shuttered, a schoolhouse with its bell frozen mid-swing, and a library whose shelves she suspected were more dust than books. But it was the people, or lack thereof, that struck her the most. She saw only a handful of figures, bundled against the cold, their faces obscured by scarves and hoods. They watched her as she passed, their eyes unreadable. The town square was dominated by a statue of a robed figure holding a hymnal, its face worn smooth by the elements. A plaque at its base read, "To those who sang for eternity." Lena frowned, snapping a photo. The phrase was as cryptic as it was ominous. When night fell, the snow ceased, leaving behind a landscape that glittered under the moonlight. The cathedral loomed in the distance, its spire stark against the starless sky. Lena's breath came in frosty puffs as she approached, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air grew heavier the closer she came, as if the building itself exhaled an unseen weight. The door groaned open with a sound like a dying gasp, and Lena stepped inside. The cathedral was colder than the night outside, its vast interior filled with an almost tangible chill. Her footsteps echoed in the emptiness, each one a sharp intrusion on the oppressive silence. The pews were intact but dust-covered, their wood warped with age. The altar stood at the far end, a grandiose structure of marble and gold that seemed out of place in such a desolate town. Lena's flashlight swept across the walls, revealing faded frescoes depicting angels and saints. At first glance, they seemed like any other religious artwork, but as her light lingered, she noticed something strange. The faces of the figures were indistinct, their features blurred as if the paint had been deliberately smudged. The hymnals lay scattered across the pews, their pages yellowed and brittle. Lena picked one up, her gloved fingers brushing against the parchment. The notes of the unfinished hymn were there, a melody that seemed simple at first glance but grew more complex the longer she studied it. It was as if the music itself was alive, its rhythm pulsating in her mind. She shook her head, trying to dispel the strange sensation, and tucked the hymnal into her bag. She spent hours exploring, documenting every detail. The cathedral revealed little of its secrets, but Lena felt certain there was more. A staircase spiraled down into the crypts, and she hesitated before descending. The air grew colder with each step, the silence deepening until it was almost unbearable. The crypt was small, its walls lined with alcoves that held ancient, decayed remains. But it was the central chamber that caught her attention. In the middle of the room stood a pedestal, and upon it rested a music box. It was ornate, its brass casing engraved with intricate patterns. Lena reached out, her fingers trembling, and wound the mechanism. The box began to play, its melody hauntingly beautiful and eerily familiar. As the notes filled the chamber, Lena felt a presence. Something watching, something waiting. She didn't stay long after that. The music lingered in her mind as she climbed back to the surface, her heart pounding in her chest. The cathedral loomed behind her as she hurried back to the inn, its silhouette a dark stain against the snowy landscape. In her room, Lena reviewed her recordings. The photographs were crisp, the notes detailed, but it was the audio recording that sent a shiver down her spine. Beneath the sound of the music box, faint and almost imperceptible, were whispers. She played it again, her fingers trembling. This time, she could make out a single word, repeated over and over, barely more than a breath. Stay. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Hymn. The morning came sluggishly, a pale gray light filtering through the frost-bitten window of Lena's room. Outside, the snow-covered town lay under a heavy sky, as if the storm had left behind not just snow but a lingering sense of unease. Lena woke with a start, her dreams tangled with the echoes of the melody she had heard the night before. The music box's haunting tune hummed in her mind, and worse, the whispers that had crept into her recording still seemed to breathe in the room. Sitting at the edge of the bed, she replayed the audio for what felt like the 100th time. Her headphones were snug over her ears, blocking out the muffled sounds of the world outside. The whispers were there again, faint but undeniable, growing louder with each play. The word "stay" now seemed almost pleading, as though something or someone was begging her not to leave. She shook her head, rubbing her temples. She didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or any of the supernatural nonsense the townsfolk likely attributed to the cathedral. Yet, there was something about this place, an oppressive atmosphere that seeped into her thoughts and clouded her reason. It was the same feeling that had drawn her here, like a moth to a flame, despite every rational warning. Determined to shake off the unease, Lena bundled herself in layers and stepped outside. The snow crunched underfoot as she walked through the town, her breath misting in the cold air. She had planned to interview the locals today, but as she wandered the narrow streets, it became clear that Ashbourne was even more withdrawn than she'd realized. Doors were shut tightly, windows covered with thick curtains. The few people she saw scurried away at her approach, their faces hidden beneath scarves and hoods. Still, Lena refused to give up. She found herself at the general store, its sign faded and barely legible. Inside, the shelves were sparsely stocked, and the air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic. The man behind the counter was middle-aged, his face pale and lined with worry. He didn't look up as she entered, his focus fixed on arranging cans of soup with methodical precision. She didn't need his cooperation. All she needed was observation. His trembling hands, and the way he avoided glancing toward the cathedral through the store's frosted window spoke volumes. These people weren't just superstitious. They were afraid, deeply and genuinely afraid. She lingered just long enough to buy a thermos of coffee and some snacks before heading back out into the cold. Her next stop was the town library, a squat, unassuming building near the square. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and aging paper. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows across the cramped aisles of books. The librarian, a frail woman whose face seemed to be all angles and sharp lines, emerged from the shadows as Lena approached. She didn't speak, merely tilted her head in acknowledgement before shuffling back to her desk. Lena searched the shelves for anything that might provide more insight into the cathedral or the missing choir. Eventually, she found a dusty ledger, its spine cracked and pages brittle. It appeared to be a collection of local lore and historical accounts. Flipping through its pages, she found scattered references to the cathedral, always shrouded in ambiguity. The building was said to have been constructed by a wealthy nobleman in the late 1800s, its purpose unclear. Some entries claimed it was a monument to his faith. Others whispered of darker intentions. The entries about the choir were more fragmented. There were mentions of a special hymn written by the cathedral's conductor, a man named Elias Morick. Morick had been renowned for his compositions, but his final work was said to have been gifted to him in a dream. Its melody so divine it could summon the heavens themselves. No one had seen him after the night of the choir's disappearance, and his name was rarely spoken in Ashbourne after that. The ledger mentioned the hymn in vague terms, describing it as incomplete and cursed. There were accounts of those who had tried to reconstruct it from memory or play its fragments, only to suffer strange accidents, illness, or madness. Lena's heart raced as she read, her fingers tightening around the brittle pages. She closed the book and slid it into her bag. The librarian watched her with a strange intensity but said nothing. As Lena stepped outside, the daylight was already beginning to fade, the snow falling once more in soft, relentless flakes. She knew she had to return to the cathedral. There was something there, something tied to Morick, the choir, and the hymn. Her curiosity burned hotter than her fear, and by the time she reached the cathedral's front steps, she barely hesitated before pushing the heavy doors open once more. Inside, the air was thick and unmoving, colder than the night outside. Lena's flashlight beam danced across the pews, casting long shadows on the walls. She made her way to the altar, where the hymnals still lay open. This time, she examined them more closely, noting how the notes of the hymn seemed to shift as she stared. It wasn't possible, of course, but it felt as though the melody was alive, waiting for her to understand it. Her exploration led her once again to the crypt. The music box still rested on its pedestal, untouched since she had wound it the night before. Lena hesitated before approaching, her breath shallow. She reached out and brushed her fingers against the cool brass surface. This time, she didn't wind it. Instead, she bent down to examine the pedestal more closely, noticing an inscription etched into the stone. The words were in Latin, and Lena's knowledge of the language was rudimentary at best. She jotted them down in her notebook, planning to translate them later. But even without knowing the exact meaning, she could feel the weight of the words, like a warning or a plea. As she stood, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. The alcoves lining the crypt's walls weren't empty, at least, not all of them. In one, she saw the faint outline of a figure, shrouded in darkness. Her flashlight flickered, and the figure was gone. Her heart pounded as she backed away, nearly tripping over the uneven floor. She climbed the stairs 2 at a time, bursting out into the main hall of the cathedral. The silence was deafening, and she could feel eyes on her, though she saw no one. When she finally stepped outside, the cold air hit her like a slap. She looked back at the cathedral, its dark spire cutting into the night sky. For the first time, she felt a pang of doubt. Back at the inn, Lena locked herself in her room and set to work translating the Latin inscription. When she finally pieced it together, her blood ran cold. The words read, "Those who hear the hymn shall never leave." Chapter 3. Echoes of Silence. The wind howled through Ashbourne as if carrying the wails of unseen specters, rattling the inn's windows as Lena sat hunched over her notes. The inscription haunted her thoughts. "Those who hear the hymn shall never leave." The cryptic warning gnawed at her resolve, each word etched into her mind like a growing frost spreading over her determination. She played the recording from the cathedral again, her headphones wrapped snugly around her ears. The whispers were louder this time, almost distinct. They layered beneath the melody of the music box, weaving through the notes like threads of shadow. The word "stay" emerged again, more desperate now, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic sound, like breathing. Lena yanked off the headphones, her pulse racing. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was something more, something alive. The gray morning brought no relief. The storm had returned, heavy snow blotting out the sun and turning the world into a cold, suffocating blur. Yet Lena felt a strange compulsion to venture back to the cathedral. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, as if the place itself was calling to her, pulling her closer. Before she left, she reviewed her findings. The ledger from the library, the inscription in the crypt, the hymnals, all pointed to the unfinished hymn and the mysterious conductor, Elias Morick. The details were maddeningly vague, but one thing was clear. The hymn had power. It had taken the choir, bound them to the cathedral, and left their fate a chilling mystery. As she prepared to leave, Lena's gaze fell on the mirror above the dresser. For a moment, she froze. Something in her reflection seemed off. The light in the room dimmed slightly, and her reflection appeared to move a split second behind her, as though it were lagging. She blinked, and the illusion was gone. Shaking off the unease, she bundled up and stepped into the storm. The walk to the cathedral felt longer this time, the wind cutting through her coat and stinging her skin. The snow muffled every sound, creating an eerie silence that made the world feel hollow. The town seemed even more lifeless than before, the buildings shrouded in white and the streets utterly deserted. When she reached the cathedral, she hesitated at the door. The air around the structure felt heavier, charged with a strange energy. She pressed her gloved hand against the cold wood, pushing it open with a groan that echoed through the vast interior. Inside, the cathedral was just as she had left it, frozen in time, silent and foreboding. The hymnals lay scattered across the pews, their pages open to the unfinished hymn. The altar loomed at the far end, a monolithic presence that seemed to watch her as she approached. She moved cautiously, her flashlight sweeping over the walls. The frescoes were as blurred and distorted as before, their faces smudged into oblivion. But now, as the beam of light passed over them, she noticed something new. The figures seemed to shift, not visibly, but in the corner of her vision. Their positions were subtly different, their blurred faces angled toward her as if they were watching. Lena's breath hitched, her pulse quickening. She shook her head, chalking it up to her imagination. But the feeling of being observed only grew stronger. She reached the altar and pulled out her notebook, flipping to the page with the Latin inscription. The crypt had more answers. She was sure of it. But the thought of descending into that cold, Suffocating space again made her stomach churn. With a deep breath, she made her way to the staircase. The steps creaked beneath her weight, the sound echoing down into the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint scent of decay tickled her nose. The crypt was as she had left it, the alcoves lining the walls filled with shadows that seemed to press closer as she entered. The music box still rested on its pedestal, its brass surface glinting faintly in the dim light of her flashlight. This time, she didn't touch it. Instead, she focused on the alcoves. She approached the one where she thought she had seen the figure the night before. Her flashlight revealed nothing at first, just an empty space, its stone surface worn and cracked. But as she stepped closer, she noticed faint scratches on the wall. The marks were erratic, jagged, as though made by someone in a desperate frenzy. They formed no coherent pattern, but the sight of them sent a chill down her spine. As she moved to the next alcove, her flashlight flickered. The light dimmed, sputtered, and then went out entirely, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged through her as she fumbled for the spare batteries in her pocket. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of her own breathing. But then, beneath the rasp of her breath, she heard it, the faint melody of the music box playing on its own. Her hands trembled as she replaced the batteries, her flashlight flickering back to life. When the beam illuminated the crypt once more, her blood ran cold. The music box was still on its pedestal, but the lid was open now, its gears turning slowly. And surrounding her, in every alcove, were figures. They were barely visible, their forms shrouded in shadow, but their presence was undeniable. They stood motionless, their heads tilted as though listening to the music. Lena stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her grip. The figures didn't move, but she felt their attention on her, heavy and oppressive. The music grew louder, the haunting melody filling the crypt. She turned and fled, her footsteps echoing as she raced up the stairs. The cold air of the cathedral hit her like a wall, but she didn't stop until she was outside, the storm wrapping around her like a shroud. She didn't look back as she stumbled through the snow, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the inn, she locked the door to her room and collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling. The whispers were louder now, not just in her recording but in her mind. They murmured to her in the darkness, their voices weaving through her thoughts like a sinister lullaby. And through it all, one word repeated, over and over: stay. Chapter 4. The Hymnal's Curse. The storm raged through the night, its winds howling like anguished cries as Lena lay awake, her mind trapped in an endless loop of dread and questions. The figures in the crypt, the music box's haunting melody, and the whispers, always the whispers, had wrapped themselves around her thoughts like a vice. She couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind, searching for some rational explanation, but deep down, she knew there was none. At some point, exhaustion claimed her. Her dreams were chaotic, filled with fragmented images of the cathedral, the blurred frescoes, and shadowy figures reaching for her with hands that dissolved into smoke. The hymn played in the background of it all, a chilling counterpoint to the chaos. She woke with a start, her body drenched in cold sweat. Pale light filtered through the window, revealing a world blanketed in fresh snow. The storm had passed, leaving behind a deathly stillness. It was as though the town itself was holding its breath. Lena sat up, her head pounding. Her notebook lay open on the nightstand, its pages filled with frantic scribbles from the night before. She flipped through them, her own handwriting barely recognizable. In the margins, she had written fragments of the hymn's melody, though she had no memory of doing so. Her stomach churned as she realized what she had to do. The answers weren't going to come from the crypt or the cathedral alone. She needed to know more about Elias Morick, The composer whose unfinished hymn seemed to hold the key to everything. The library was eerily quiet when Lena arrived, its single bulb casting dim light over the rows of dusty books. The librarian was nowhere to be seen, which suited Lena just fine. She didn't want to explain why she was back or what she was looking for. She returned to the ledger she had found the day before, flipping through its brittle pages until she reached the section on Morik. There wasn't much, just vague references to his genius and his supposed divine inspiration, but one entry caught her eye. Morik's private study, hidden within the cathedral, is said to hold the only complete score of his final hymn. Few have dared to search for it, and none have returned with answers. A hidden study. The idea both thrilled and terrified her. If such a place existed, it might contain the missing pieces of the hymn and the truth about what happened to the choir. But it also meant venturing deeper into the cathedral's shadows, into the unknown. The ledger provided no clues as to the study's location, but Lena felt certain it would be somewhere near the altar. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. By the time she reached the cathedral, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow-covered town. The wind had picked up again, whistling through the streets as if urging her to turn back. She ignored it, her determination outweighing her fear. The cathedral loomed before her, its spire piercing the darkening sky. The doors opened with a groan, and she stepped inside, her breath fogging in the frigid air. The interior was just as she had left it, silent, oppressive, and cold. Lena made her way to the altar, her flashlight casting long, dancing shadows across the pews. She searched the walls behind the altar, running her hands over the cold stone. At first, she found nothing, but as her fingers traced the edge of a carved relief, she felt a slight indentation, a crack. Her pulse quickened as she pressed against it, and with a grinding sound, a section of the wall shifted inward, revealing a narrow passageway. The air that wafted out was colder than ice, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Lena hesitated, her flashlight trembling in her hand. But she couldn't turn back now. The passage was tight and claustrophobic, its walls damp and slick with frost. Her footsteps echoed faintly as she descended deeper into the cathedral's bowels. The corridor twisted and turned, disorienting her until she had no sense of direction. Finally, the passage opened into a small chamber. The room was bare except for a wooden desk, a single chair, and shelves filled with crumbling books and yellowed papers. At the center of the desk lay a bound manuscript, its leather cover cracked with age. Lena approached cautiously, her flashlight illuminating the manuscript. The title was etched in faded gold lettering, Finale Divinum. Her heart raced as she opened the cover. The pages were filled with sheet music, intricate and beautiful, but the notes seemed almost impossible to decipher. As she flipped through the pages, she realized why the hymn was considered unfinished. Entire sections were missing, the gaps marked by strange symbols she couldn't understand. Her mind raced as she studied the manuscript, trying to piece together its structure. But then she noticed something else. In the margins of the pages, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand, were annotations in Latin. They spoke of binding voices and the eternal audience. One line stood out. To complete the hymn is to join the choir. The words sent a chill through her. She closed the manuscript and stepped back, her flashlight sweeping over the room. That was when she saw it. A figure standing in the corner, shrouded in shadow. It didn't move, but Lena felt its eyes on her, cold and unrelenting. She stumbled backward, clutching the manuscript to her chest. The figure took a step forward, and then another, its movements slow and deliberate. Lena turned and ran, the passageway twisting around her as she raced toward the faint light of the cathedral. She burst out into the main hall, gasping for breath, and slammed the hidden door shut behind her. The manuscript felt like a lead weight in her hands as she fled the cathedral, the shadows seeming to stretch toward her as she ran. Back at the inn, Lena locked her door and barricaded it with a chair. She spread the manuscript out on the bed, her hands shaking as she examined the music. The notes seemed to pulse on the page, their melody echoing faintly in her mind. She played the recording from the crypt again, listening to the whispers. This time, the word was different. Finish. Her blood turned to ice. She looked down at the manuscript, the unfinished hymn staring back at her. It wasn't just a composition, it was a curse. And now it was hers. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Candlelight. The storm returned with a vengeance, the wind screaming against the windows of Lena's room as she sat hunched over the manuscript. Outside, the snow whipped through the air in violent spirals, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside her mind. The unfinished hymn stared back at her from the pages, its notes jagged and alien, yet strangely alluring. The whispers from her recordings now seemed to align with the music, weaving themselves into the melody as if they had always been part of it. She had spent hours trying to decipher the strange symbols marking the gaps in the composition. They weren't part of any musical notation she recognized, and the annotations in Latin offered no clarity. Instead, they seemed to taunt her with phrases like vox mene, the voice remains, and finis aeternum, the eternal end. The words twisted in her mind, becoming part of the hymn itself. It was as if the music wasn't just written on the page, but was alive, reaching into her thoughts and reshaping them. By midday, the storm showed no signs of relenting. The town was buried under a fresh blanket of snow, its streets lifeless and still. Lena hadn't eaten since morning, her appetite dulled by the oppressive weight of the hymn. She paced the room, her thoughts spiraling. The phrase to complete the hymn is to join the choir replayed over and over in her mind. What did it mean? Who or what was the choir? The figures in the crypt? The whispers in her recordings? Her gaze fell on her audio equipment, the recorder still sitting on the desk where she had left it. The last time she played the recording, the whispers had said finish. She wasn't sure she could bear to hear it again, but the pull of curiosity was too strong to ignore. She pressed play. The music box's melody started, familiar and haunting. But this time, the whispers were louder, almost drowning out the tune. They formed words, fragments of sentences in a voice that was both distant and intimate, like a breath against her ear. Complete. The hymn. Free us. Her skin prickled. The voice wasn't just in the recording, it was in the room with her. She spun around, her eyes scanning the empty space. The whispers faded, replaced by a faint hum, as if the air itself was vibrating with the hymn's unfinished melody. And then, something else. A low, mournful tone, like a human voice trying to sing but failing, rose from the corner of the room. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound grew louder, the tone deepening into something that was almost a chant. She reached for her flashlight, shining it toward the corner. Nothing. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Lena's hands trembled as she turned off the recorder. She couldn't stay in the room any longer. She needed answers, and there was only one place to find them. The cathedral was a monolith against the storm, its spire reaching into the swirling sky like a jagged claw. Lena trudged through the snow, her breath fogging in the frigid air. She carried the manuscript in her bag, its weight a constant reminder of what she was risking. Inside, the cathedral was colder than ever, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. The frescoes on the walls seemed more distorted now, their shapes writhing in the corners of her vision. The altar loomed ahead, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. She approached cautiously, her footsteps echoing through the vast hall. The hymnals were still scattered across the pews, their pages frozen in time. But something was different. The air hummed with a low vibration, like the resonance of a tuning fork. It was subtle at first, but as Lena moved closer to the altar, it grew stronger, vibrating through her bones. She placed the manuscript on the altar and opened it to the first page. The music seemed to pulse beneath her fingertips, the notes shimmering faintly in the dim light. She pulled out her audio recorder, setting it down beside the manuscript. "I need to understand," she murmured, her voice breaking the silence for the first time. She placed her hands on the manuscript, tracing the notes with her fingers. As she did, the air around her seemed to shift. The temperature dropped even further, and the hum deepened into a guttural resonance. And then, she heard it. A voice, low and melodic, began to sing the hymn. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, joined by others until a full choir filled the cathedral. The voices were beautiful yet unnerving, their harmonies weaving together in a melody that was both divine and terrible. Lena looked around, her flashlight sweeping over the pews. The shadows deepened, pooling like liquid around the edges of the room. The choir continued to sing, their voices growing more intense. The hymn was incomplete, and she could feel the strain in their song, as though they were trapped in an endless loop, unable to move forward. The manuscript on the altar seemed to glow faintly, its pages shimmering with a pale light. The missing sections of the hymn filled themselves in, the strange symbols transforming into notes. She stared in disbelief. The hymn was completing itself, but as the final note appeared on the page, the light flared, blinding her. The choir's voices reached a deafening crescendo, and then silence. When Lena opened her eyes, the cathedral was dark and still. The manuscript lay closed on the altar, its cover unmarked. She picked it up, her hands trembling. The air was heavy with the scent of burning wax and something sweeter, like decay masked by perfume. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye. The frescoes on the walls were no longer blurred. The figures had faces now, faces she recognized. They were the missing choir, their eyes hollow and mouths open in eternal song. Lena stumbled backward, her heart pounding. The shadows on the walls stretched toward her, their forms shifting and writhing. She ran, the manuscript clutched tightly in her hands. The cathedral's doors slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the empty town. Back in her room, Lena locked the door and stared at the manuscript. The hymn was complete now, its melody etched into her mind. But as she listened to the silence, she realized something. The whispers were gone, and so was her voice. Chapter 6. The Choir That Never Left. The silence in Lena's room was oppressive, louder than any sound she had ever heard. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her lips forming words that refused to materialize. The realization struck her like a blow. She couldn't speak. Panic surged through her. She clutched her throat, her mind racing. She tried to scream, to call for help, but her voice was gone, stolen as surely as if it had been plucked from her body. The manuscript sat on the desk, its leather cover glinting faintly in the dim light. It seemed to mock her, its presence a sinister reminder of what she had done. She stumbled back, her legs giving way beneath her as she collapsed onto the bed. The events of the past hours replayed in her mind, each moment more surreal than the last. The hymn's completion had unleashed something beyond her understanding. Her trembling hands reached for her audio recorder. She pressed play, hoping to hear the melody again, to confirm that the whispers were truly gone. The recording began, the familiar tune of the music box filling the room. But instead of whispers, a single, haunting voice emerged, clear and melodic. Lena. She dropped the recorder, her blood turning to ice. The voice was unmistakable. It was hers. She didn't sleep that night. The hours stretched endlessly, the storm outside clawing at the windows like an impatient predator. Lena sat on the floor, her knees drawn to her chest, the manuscript a looming presence on the desk. She couldn't stop replaying the recording in her mind. The voice wasn't just hers, it was singing. The melody was the hymn, complete and flawless, as though it had been waiting for her to finish it all along. But how? She had never sung a note in her life, let alone something as complex as Morik's cursed composition. And yet, the voice on the recording carried the weight of centuries, a lamentation that seemed to span time itself. As dawn broke, a faint light seeped through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. Lena's eyes burned from lack of sleep, but she couldn't bring herself to rest. Something was coming. She could feel it in the air, a pressure that grew with each passing moment. Her gaze drifted to the manuscript. It seemed almost alive now, its presence suffocating. She needed answers. The library was her only option. The snow had eased, but the streets were still eerily quiet. Lena wrapped herself in her thickest coat and ventured out, the manuscript tucked under her arm. Her footsteps echoed in the stillness, the sound unnaturally loud against the backdrop of silence. When she reached the library, she found the doors unlocked despite the early hour. The interior was dimly lit, the single bulb flickering faintly. She moved quickly, her breath visible in the frigid air. She needed to know more about Elias Morik and his curse at him, what it meant, why it was created, and how she had become ensnared in its web. She returned to the ledger, flipping through its brittle pages with desperate hands. There was little more to be found about Morik, but one passage caught her eye. Morik spoke of his work as a gift from the divine, though others whispered that it was a curse born of hubris. He claimed the hymn would transcend mortality, binding its singers to eternity. But eternity, it seemed, was a prison. The words sent a chill through her. Binding its singers to eternity. Lena's fingers tightened around the edges of the page. The choir, the figures in the crypt, the frescoes, the whispers. They weren't ghosts. They were trapped. She left the library in a daze, the manuscript growing heavier in her arms with every step. The truth was beginning to take shape, its edges sharp and jagged. The hymn wasn't just music. It was a ritual, a trap disguised as a masterpiece. Back at the inn, Lena sat at the desk, staring at the manuscript. Her reflection in the window caught her attention, and she froze. The image wasn't quite right. Her reflection stared back at her, but its movements were delayed, its expression wrong. The eyes were darker, the mouth set in a faint, unnatural smile. She turned away, her heart pounding. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in around her. And then the voices returned. They started as faint murmurs, barely audible, but they grew louder, their tones harmonious and haunting. They came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room with a melody that was achingly beautiful and utterly terrifying. "Join us." The words wrapped around her, pulling at her mind. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it was useless. The hymn wasn't just sound. It was inside her, resonating in her very bones. The manuscript began to glow faintly, the notes shimmering on the page. The melody pulsed in time with her heartbeat, each note a dagger of cold. Lena stumbled to her feet, the manuscript clutched tightly in her hands. She had to end this. She didn't know how, but she couldn't let it consume her. Her only thought was the cathedral. The journey through the snow was a blur. The town seemed even more lifeless now, the buildings mere shadows against the pale landscape. The cathedral loomed ahead, its spire piercing the gray sky like a beacon. Inside, the air was colder than ever, the shadows darker. The frescoes stared down at her, their faces now fully formed and unmistakably human. She approached the altar, her breath visible in the freezing air. The manuscript trembled in her hands, its glow growing stronger. The hymn was alive now, its melody echoing faintly in the silence. Lena placed the manuscript on the altar and stepped back. The air around her seemed to ripple, the shadows stretching and shifting. And then they appeared. Figures emerged from the darkness, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. They surrounded her, their faces hidden in shadow, their presence suffocating. The choir. Their voices rose in unison, the hymn filling the cathedral with a sound that was both divine and monstrous. Lena fell to her knees, the weight of the music crushing her. The manuscript opened on its own, its pages flipping wildly. The final notes of the hymn glowed brightly, their light filling the room. The choir's voices reached a deafening crescendo, and Lena felt herself being pulled into the music, her very essence unraveling. And then silence. When Lena opened her eyes, she was no longer in the cathedral. She stood in an endless void, the air thick with the scent of decay and sweetness. The choir surrounded her, their faces no longer shadowed. They stared at her with hollow eyes, their mouths open in silent song. She tried to scream, but no sound came. And then she realized she was singing. Her voice joined the choir, weaving through their harmonies in a melody that was eternal. The manuscript was gone, but its song lived on, binding her to the hymn forever. Lena was no longer herself. She was part of the music now, her voice one of many in the silent requiem. Chapter 7. Harmony of the Damned. The void was endless. A cavern of lightless space stretched infinitely in all directions, and Lena floated at its center, suspended by the weight of a song that was no longer hers. The hymn had consumed her, reshaped her essence into something alien and eternal. She could feel the other voices, the lost souls of the choir, pressing against her consciousness. They weren't distinct, but their sorrow and desperation were palpable. Their melodies wove around her, binding her tighter into their collective, an endless loop of harmony and lamentation. For what felt like days, though time had no meaning here, she tried to fight it. Her thoughts struggled against the oppressive tide of music, clawing for individuality, for freedom. But the hymn was relentless, a tidal wave that drowned every attempt to surface. And then she felt it, a flicker of something outside the void, a faint pull, like a thread being tugged from the other side of a veil. The song faltered for a moment, the harmony breaking as the pull grew stronger. Lena clung to it, focusing all her will on the faint sensation. It was the first shred of hope she'd felt since being trapped here, and she wasn't about to let it go. In the waking world, the town lay in the grip of an unnatural stillness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape buried in snow and silence. The cathedral stood at its center, its spire piercing the gray sky like a needle. Inside, the air was thick with the remnants of the hymn. The manuscript lay open on the altar, its pages shimmering faintly in the dim light. And then it began to move. The notes on the page shifted, their shapes twisting and reforming as though alive. The air around the manuscript pulsed with energy, a faint hum that grew louder with each passing moment. The hum resonated through the cathedral, reaching out into the town like a signal. It called to something, someone, far away. Miles from the town, a man stirred in his sleep. He awoke with a start, his chest heaving as though he'd been running. His name was Elias, and he had been drawn here by dreams he couldn't explain. For weeks, he had been haunted by visions of a cathedral, a hymn, and a woman's face. He didn't know her, but her image was burned into his mind, accompanied by a melody that echoed in his waking hours. He dressed quickly, his movements hurried and frantic. He couldn't ignore the pull any longer. Something was calling him, and he had to answer. In the void, Lena felt the pull growing stronger. The hymn around her began to fray, the perfect harmony breaking into discordant fragments. The other voices in the choir screamed in protest, their melodies clashing violently. The void itself seemed to tremble, the once endless darkness flickering with faint traces of light. Lena pushed harder, her thoughts reaching for the source of the pull. And then, for the first time since her entrapment, she felt her own voice. It was faint, almost drowned out by the choir, but it was hers. She sang a single note, the sound cutting through the chaos like a blade. The void erupted in light. Elias arrived at the town as night fell, the air thick with an unnatural quiet. The streets were deserted, the windows of the houses dark and lifeless. The snow crunched under his boots as he made his way toward the cathedral, its spire looming in the distance. As he approached, the hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through his chest. The melody in his mind became clearer, guiding his steps. The cathedral doors creaked open under his touch, the sound echoing through the empty hall. Inside, the air was cold and still, the faint glow of the manuscript drawing his attention. He moved toward the altar, his eyes fixed on the pages. The notes shimmered faintly, their shapes shifting as though alive. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the manuscript. The room exploded with sound. In the void, Lena felt the rupture like a thunderclap. The hymn shattered, its fragments tearing through the choir as light poured in from every direction. The voices screamed, their melodies unraveling as the void collapsed around them. Lena's voice grew stronger, her song rising above the chaos. She sang the hymn backward, undoing its power with every note. The light consumed her, pulling her out of the void and into the waking world. Elias staggered back as the manuscript burst into flames, the fire consuming the pages in seconds. The glow filled the cathedral, illuminating the frescoes on the walls. The figures in the frescoes began to move, their faces contorted in anguish as they dissolved into smoke. The choir's voices echoed one last time, a final lamentation before fading into silence. And then, from the smoke, a figure emerged. Lena collapsed onto the altar, her body trembling as she gasped for air. She was alive, but the hymn's melody still echoed faintly in her mind. Elias rushed to her side, his hands steadying her as she struggled to stand. She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear and recognition. "You heard it too," she rasped, her voice hoarse but her own. He nodded, his expression grim. "It's not over." The manuscript was gone, reduced to ash, but its power lingered in the air. The hymn had been silenced, but the cost was far from clear. As Lena and Elias left the cathedral, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, haunting melody. The hymn was quiet now, but its echo remained. Chapter 8. The Return of the Song. The town was eerily quiet as Lena and Elias made their way back through the snow-covered streets. The heavy clouds hung low, as if the sky itself had been scarred by the events in the cathedral. Despite the relief that the hymn had been silenced, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was still waiting, something just beyond the reach of her understanding. Elias walked beside her, his expression unreadable, his eyes distant. He had been quiet since the moment Lena had emerged from the flames. The manuscript, the choir, the hymn. Everything had been undone, and yet the tension between them remained. Lena wanted to ask him about the strange pull he had felt toward the town, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she focused on the rhythmic crunch of their footsteps in the snow, the only sound in a world that had been forced to hold its breath. They reached the inn without speaking, and Lena didn't wait for him to follow her inside. The fire had died down in the hearth, and the room felt colder than it should have been. She threw her coat aside, her mind racing with fragments of memories that refused to fit together. She turned back to see Elias standing in the doorway, his eyes still fixed on her, But there was something else, something darker in his gaze. "What happened in the cathedral?" he asked quietly. Lena took a deep breath, but the words didn't come. The hymn had been broken, but it was as if a piece of it still clung to the edges of her consciousness, an invisible thread tethering her to something much larger than herself. "I don't know," she said finally, "but it's not over. I can still hear it, the song." Elias stepped closer, his face shadowed by the dim light. "I thought we destroyed it. The choir, the manuscript, everything. I thought we did too," Lena whispered. But the moment the hymn was broken, it became something else. The voices, she stopped herself. She didn't want to sound insane. She had heard the choir, heard the song in the void, and it had felt alive, unshakable. "I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like we've only interrupted the cycle, not ended it." Elias didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted to the window, where the heavy snowfall continued to fall in a relentless torrent. The town was buried under its weight, isolated, like a forgotten world in the middle of nowhere. "What if we're wrong?" he asked, his voice low. "What if we weren't supposed to destroy the hymn at all?" Lena stared at him, unsure of what he meant. Her heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" "The hymn," he repeated, his voice colder now, almost imperceptibly. "Maybe it wasn't meant to be broken. Maybe it was never meant to be a curse. Maybe it was meant to be completed. The choir, the music, the voices, they were waiting for someone to finish it. Maybe that's why it's still alive, because it's never truly been done." Lena shook her head, an overwhelming sense of dread washing over her. "You can't be serious." Elias turned toward her, his eyes dark and intense. "I'm not saying it's right, but I think it was always meant to be this way." The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer as if the very walls of the inn were closing in. The fire sputtered, flickering in the hearth, and for a moment, Lena thought she saw something in the glow. A shape, a figure, flickering just beyond her vision. But when she blinked, it was gone. Her pulse quickened. "What do you want from me, Elias? You're not suggesting we go back, are you? After everything?" Elias's silence was answer enough. The days that followed felt like a blur. The town remained locked in a kind of suspended animation, as if it too had been touched by the forces Lena and Elias had unleashed. No one came in or out. The world beyond the snow seemed to have forgotten the town even existed. Lena spent her time alone in her room, staring at the empty manuscript that now sat on her desk. She couldn't bring herself to touch it, couldn't bring herself to acknowledge that she had once been part of the choir, part of the music. The memory of the hymn and its voices still pulsed in her mind, like an echo that refused to fade. Elias had disappeared, slipping out one morning without a word. She had tried to call to him, to ask him what he was doing, but her voice failed her. Once again, it was gone. It seemed the hymn's influence over her was deeper than she had realized. Each day she waited for him to return, but the longer he stayed away, the more something else began to stir. She could feel the pull again, stronger now, more insistent, like a tide rising beneath the ice. And then, on the fourth day, she could hear it, the faintest trace of the melody, weaving through the silence of her room. She turned toward the desk, her heart hammering. The manuscript, still open from the night before, had begun to glow again. No, she couldn't go back, but the song was pulling at her. The notes were familiar, impossible to ignore. A voice, her voice, was calling to her, joining the others in their eternal chorus. She stood up, her legs trembling beneath her, and walked to the desk. As she reached out to touch the manuscript, the music grew louder, filling the room with its melody. It wasn't just a song, it was a command. Lena's fingers brushed the paper, and the room seemed to shudder. The air hummed with energy, vibrating like a string pulled taut, her breath caught in her throat, her body shivering from the force of it. The light from the manuscript was no longer pale. It was blinding. And then, as if in response to her touch, the world around her seemed to fracture. The walls of the room stretched, twisted, and then vanished entirely, leaving her standing in an empty, featureless space. She could still hear the choir, their voices now distinct, growing louder with every passing second. She was not alone. She was never alone. Lena, Elias's voice echoed, faint and distant, yet impossibly close. It's time. The song is calling to you. Don't resist it. The floor beneath her feet began to pulse in time with the music, each beat shaking her to her core. The air shimmered, and in the distance, she saw him. Elias, standing in the center of the void, his arms outstretched, his face twisted in an expression of ecstatic surrender. He had become part of the choir. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had to move, but her body refused to obey. She was trapped in the music, and the more she resisted, the stronger it grew. She could feel the presence of the others, the lost souls, the forgotten singers, and she knew, with a terrible certainty, that they had never truly left. The hymn was not a curse nor a blessing. It was a binding. The choir was eternal, its song never to be completed, never to cease. And now, Lena was part of it. She could feel herself slipping away, her essence unraveling in the music. The last thing she heard before the void claimed her was Elias's voice, soft and compelling, whispering the final verse. Join us. Sing with us. Forever. And Lena, in the end, could not resist. Chapter 9. The Conductor's Secret. When Lena awoke, she was no longer in the void. The oppressive darkness had receded, replaced by a strange, disorienting light. Her senses were numb, her mind foggy as though she had been submerged underwater for too long. But the sound of the hymn, loud, overwhelming, was still present, thrumming beneath her skin, vibrating through her very bones. Her eyes flickered open, but the world around her was unfamiliar. She was no longer in the cathedral or the inn. There were no walls, no boundaries, just an endless expanse of white, as though the very fabric of reality had unraveled and reformed into something new. Lena tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. Panic rose within her, sharp and cold, but it was swiftly drowned out by the pull of the song. It was soothing, relentless. The voices, no, the choir, were all around her, their harmonies entwining, rising and falling like a tide. She was a part of it now, but it wasn't Elias she could sense beside her. It was something else, something darker. The other voices that had once been distant and fragmented now felt closer. Their presence was suffocating, the pressure of their collective will pressing in from all sides. The realization struck her like a thunderclap. The choir, this world, was not the same as before. It had changed. It had evolved, and so had she. She tried to scream, but no sound emerged from her throat. She couldn't even find the words to form her fear. The silence that followed the absence of her voice was more unnerving than the constant hum of the song. It was as though the air itself was waiting for her to accept what had happened. Her body was no longer her own. She felt as if she were drifting, her consciousness separate from her physical form. Something had fused her with the hymn, had bound her to the eternal cycle of music and silence. She couldn't escape. Her thoughts, though fragmented, began to coalesce. Elias. She thought of him, the last time she had seen him. His face twisted in surrender, his body already part of the choir. The music had consumed him, just as it had consumed her. But there had been something in his eyes, a look of peace mixed with despair. He had accepted it. She hadn't. Not yet. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she turned toward it, her mind struggling to make sense of the shifting shapes in the distance. She couldn't tell if they were real or simply projections of her fractured consciousness. But as the figures drew closer, she realized they were not her imagination. They were real. Real in the sense that everything here was real. Elias was there, standing in the center of the shifting landscape, his face pale but serene. His eyes met hers, and a slight smile curved his lips. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough. He was whole again. The transformation was complete. His form, once human, had become something more, something infinite. He was a part of the choir now, no longer just a person but an eternal note in the song. Lena reached out toward him, her body responding this time, her limbs moving almost on their own. But as her hand stretched toward him, she felt it. Something more than the music. A pull. A binding force stronger than anything she had ever known. The song was no longer just an external influence. It was inside her, shaping her, guiding her. "Elias," she whispered, her voice weak, a mere echo in the cacophony of sound. He turned toward her, his expression unreadable, yet there was a calmness in his eyes. "Lena," he said, though no words came from his lips. It wasn't speech, not in the way they had once understood it. It was communication through the song. "Come with me," the song seemed to say. "Join us and be free." Her chest tightened, her breath quickening. She was here now. There was no going back, no returning to the life she had known, no escape from the song. And yet, there was a choice. The music around her intensified, rising, swirling in great waves of sound. She could feel it beckoning her, urging her to give in, to become one with the choir, to finish the song. But every instinct screamed against it. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking. She couldn't even tell if the words were her own, or if they were simply vibrations of the hymn. "Why are we here?" Elias's form flickered, like a shadow passing through the edges of her vision. His smile faded into something more solemn, more knowing. His eyes never left hers, but the expression on his face was one she could not understand, a mixture of acceptance and sorrow. "We are part of it," the song answered her, 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "The music is all that remains. The only truth. All of us, lost and forgotten, now reborn." The figures around them, the other souls, moved in strange patterns, their bodies shifting with the flow of the music. They were neither dead nor alive, but something else entirely, suspended between worlds. They had been here longer than either Lena or Elias, and yet there was no sense of time, only the eternal rhythm of the song. Lena felt her heart race as the gravity of their situation began to sink in. She was being pulled deeper into this reality, into the song, and though she had once fought against it, now she could feel it wrapping around her like a comforting blanket. She had once thought she could escape, but the truth was clear now. This was not a curse. This was a rebirth. And in that moment, Lena understood. The choir was not something to be feared. It was a state of existence, a harmony beyond the limits of mortality. To resist it was to fight against eternity itself. She had fought it once, but now she realized it was part of her. "Let go," the song whispered to her. "Let it become you." She closed her eyes, and for a moment, the world around her went still. The voices of the choir began to hum in a gentle lullaby, their harmonies merging into a single, pure note. It was the song she had once feared, but now it was familiar, warm. She let go. Her form dissolved into the air, joining the music, becoming part of the eternal hymn. There were no boundaries now, no separation. She was one with the choir. She was free. But somewhere, deep within the void, something stirred. Something ancient, something forgotten. The song had been reborn, yes, But its true nature, its true purpose, remained hidden, waiting for the moment when it would call again. And the cycle, like the endless song itself, would continue. Chapter 10. The Silence That Calls. The weight of silence pressed in on Lena, but it wasn't the kind of silence that existed before the song began. It was heavier, thicker, pregnant with anticipation. The music still thrummed within her, but it felt distant, as if the very nature of sound had changed. The voices had become part of her, woven into her being, but they no longer dominated her consciousness. They were there, quietly pulsating, a steady undercurrent to her thoughts. But the world around her was shifting in a way that made her feel as though she were no longer in control of her own existence. She floated in a space that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. There were no walls, no sky, no ground beneath her. There was only the undulating hum of the song and a strange, empty quiet that hung over everything, like a veil waiting to be torn away. At first, she had felt an overwhelming sense of belonging, of becoming one with the choir. The music had wrapped itself around her, melding her into its endless harmony. But now, that sense of unity was starting to fade. She could feel something in the distance, something beyond the song, something that pulled at her, calling to her in a way the music never had. Lena's senses were sharpened, clearer now than they had ever been. She could hear the faintest whispers of voices, but not the choirs. These were different, more distant, like fragments of memories she couldn't quite grasp. But they were growing louder, more insistent. "Who is it?" she whispered to herself, the words slipping from her lips as if they didn't belong to her. The words were ancient, unfamiliar, and yet they felt as though they had always been there. The space around her shimmered, the white expanse rippling like water. She could feel herself drawn toward it, compelled to move. But there was no ground, no direction, only the pull of something deeper, darker. Her body shifted through the nothingness, moving with a purpose she could not comprehend. And then, through the rippling light, she saw it, a figure. It stood at the edge of her perception, just beyond the reach of her understanding. A dark silhouette, its features hidden by the swirling fog of the endless space. But it wasn't alone. There were others, shadowy figures, surrounding it, watching her. Their forms flickered and shifted, as if they were not fully present in this place, as if they were not yet real. Lena's heart skipped a beat. The song pulsed inside her, but it no longer felt comforting. It felt wrong. The figures moved closer, their presence overwhelming, their whispers growing louder, more urgent. She felt the weight of their gaze, the pressure of their presence as they surrounded her, closing in from all sides. Their voices were not the voices of the choir. They were ancient, filled with a hunger that made her skin crawl. And one by one, they began to speak, though their mouths did not move. "You are here. You were meant to be here." Lena's body froze, a chill creeping up her spine as their words reverberated in her mind. She couldn't escape. She couldn't move. The figures closed in tighter, their faces flickering in and out of focus, their forms distorted by the shifting light. "We've been waiting for you." The words echoed in her mind, their meaning hanging in the air like a dark prophecy. Waiting for her? But for what? What did they want? She tried to speak, but no words came. She opened her mouth, but the sound of her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that surrounded her. She was trapped in a place between worlds, between sound and silence, between the song and the void. And then, from the center of the figures, the dark silhouette stepped forward, its shape slowly becoming more defined. The others parted, revealing the figure in full. It was a woman. At least, Lena thought it was. But she wasn't human. Not anymore. Her body was a tangle of dark, shifting shadows, her face barely visible, obscured by the tendrils of darkness that seemed to writhe and pulse in time with the song. Her eyes, those piercing, inhuman eyes, glowed with a malevolent light that made Lena's blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come here," the woman whispered. Her voice was not a voice at all, but a feeling, a sensation that filled the very space around them, vibrating with something that was neither sound nor silence, but both. Lena tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice stolen by the weight of the presence around her. The woman's eyes bore into her, the intensity of her gaze pulling at Lena's soul. "The choir does not belong to you," the woman continued, her voice twisting and distorting with every word. "The song is ours. It was never meant to be finished. It was never meant to be heard. You think you have freed yourself, but you have only awakened us. We are the ones who have been waiting. The song was never meant to be complete. You have only begun the cycle again." The words hit Lena like a blow. Her chest tightened, and for a moment, the song inside her seemed to waver. She could feel the choir, the other voices, shifting, becoming something darker, more malevolent. "The song is not a gift," the woman whispered, her lips curling into a sinister smile. "It is a curse." The figures around her began to move in rhythm with the words, their movements jerky, like puppets controlled by strings, but the strings were the song itself. The music around them wasn't the peaceful harmony she had once known. It was distorted, twisted, and filled with malice. It was a force that had been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to rise again. "You are ours now. You cannot leave." Lena's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel the weight of the song inside her, pressing against her, suffocating her. She had thought she was free, thought that by joining the choir, she would become part of something eternal, something peaceful. But this was not what she had imagined. The woman stepped closer, and the dark figures closed in around her. Lena could feel the weight of their collective gaze, the pull of their presence, drawing her further into their web. She had been mistaken. She had thought the choir was her salvation. But now, she saw the truth. The choir was not a refuge. It was a prison. The silence that had once been so deafening now felt like a cold, empty void. A vast, never-ending chasm that stretched in all directions, ready to consume everything. The song was not an escape. It was a binding, a curse. And Lena had only begun to understand the price. "It's not over," the woman's voice whispered, as if sensing Lena's realization. "It will never be over." Lena tried to turn away, but the figures closed in tighter, their forms shifting with the rhythm of the song. She was trapped in a cycle of eternal music, never to escape. The dark presence of the woman loomed over her, its eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. And as the figures reached for her, Lena realized the terrifying truth. The song would never be finished. It would never be completed. She was part of it now, part of something far larger and more terrifying than she had ever imagined. The silence that had once been the source of her fear was now the thing she feared most. The song was alive, and it would call again. Chapter 11. The Unfinished Symphony. Lena's senses reeled as the pressure of the figures closed around her, their dark forms swarming like insects on the edge of perception. Their shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, shifting and flickering in the swirling white fog that engulfed her. They were part of the silence now, just as she was, bound to the song that had become her reality. She could feel their coldness, their hunger, creeping into her mind like an invasive thought she couldn't dismiss. Her breath caught in her throat. How long have I been here? She didn't know. Time had lost meaning in this place, this fractured world between realms, where the song was the only constant. It had become the air she breathed, the blood that coursed through her veins. The song that had once sounded so beautiful was now an insistent, suffocating pulse, a reminder of the curse that bound her to this place. The woman, the dark figure who had spoken the chilling truth, loomed before her now, her inhuman eyes glowing with a terrifying clarity. The other figures lingered in the periphery, their bodies swaying in unison, like marionettes caught in the grip of an unseen force. They were not real in the way she understood reality. They were echoes, fragments of something that had existed long before her arrival. Something older. "You cannot escape," the woman whispered, the words vibrating through Lena's body, seeping into her mind. There was no sound, but the sensation of it was sharp, penetrating. "You've heard the truth now. The song has no end." Lena felt her chest tighten, as if the weight of those words were a physical presence pressing down on her. The pressure in her lungs was unbearable. The air felt thick, as though she were suffocating in the very silence that had once seemed so welcoming. Her vision blurred, and she closed her eyes, trying to push the thoughts away. She had to focus. She had to remember. There was something, some flicker of understanding, something deeper than the music, deeper than the dark figures that now surrounded her. And then, suddenly, she saw it. A fragment of memory, a fleeting image from her life before this place. Elias, his face, strained and desperate, but there was something else in his eyes. Hope. Hope? The memory was so brief, so fleeting, that Lena almost couldn't grasp it. But the sensation it left behind was undeniable. Elias hadn't surrendered. He hadn't fully accepted this fate. He had fought it. He had resisted. The realization struck her with the force of a thunderclap. She wasn't just a part of this place. She could change it. She could break the cycle. The figures, sensing the shift in her, began to close in tighter. Their whispers grew louder, more insistent, their movements quickening. The woman smiled, though her face was obscured by shadows. "You cannot fight it, child. This is the way of the song. It is eternal, and you will be one with it, as we all are." But Lena didn't listen to the woman. She couldn't. The fear that had once gripped her heart was fading now, replaced by something else. Something fierce and burning, like a flickering flame in the darkness. She could feel the song still pulsing inside her, but this time, she wasn't just a passive participant. She was aware of it, aware of the power it held, and more importantly, aware of what it could do if she resisted. She focused on the rhythm of the song, the ebb and flow of its notes, the pulse that connected them all. There was a pattern hidden beneath the surface of the chaotic noise, a rhythm that was both natural and unnatural at once, an undercurrent that had always been there, waiting for her to recognize it. Lena's mind stretched beyond the boundaries of the choir, reaching out into the emptiness. It was like falling, as though her thoughts were being pulled into an abyss. But instead of succumbing, she reached for the space between the notes, the silence that existed in the gaps. "It's there," she realized. The silence, the key. The music wasn't just a force that held them all captive. It was woven into the silence itself. The two were inseparable. One could not exist without the other. And if she could control the silence, bend it to her will, then she could break free. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling with the intensity of the effort. She could feel the song pressing in from all sides, threatening to drown her, but she pushed back. The silence in the gaps between the notes beckoned to her, and she reached for it, stretching her mind, her very soul, into the void. The figures around her writhed, their forms flickering and distorting as they sensed what she was doing. The woman stepped forward, her face warping with fury. "You cannot do this," she hissed, her voice like the crackling of a fire. "You will not escape." But Lena didn't stop. She focused on the silence, on the absence of sound, and with a mental push, she wrenched it from the core of the song. It was as though she had unlocked a door, a threshold that had been closed to her until now. The silence opened up before her like a vast, empty chasm, and for a moment, it felt as though everything around her had frozen in time. The song faltered. For the first time since she had arrived, she could hear nothing. No hum, no voice, just an eerie, almost deafening emptiness. The absence of the choir was more frightening than its presence had ever been. It felt wrong, unnatural, like the world itself had stopped spinning. And then, through the stillness, Lena heard something else. A whisper. It was faint at first, a mere breath against her ear, but it was there. A name. Elias. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't tell if it was her own mind conjuring the name, or if it was the remnants of the voices that still lingered within her, but she knew what it meant. Elias had tried to fight this, just as she was doing now. He had resisted the pull of the song, and perhaps, just perhaps, he had found a way to escape. The silence trembled again, rippling outward like a stone dropped into a pond. The figures around her screeched, their forms flickering and warping, their whispers growing frantic. The woman's shadowy face twisted in fury. "You think you can fight this?" she snarled. "But the silence is not your ally. It is as much a part of the song as the sound itself. You will not break free. None of us ever do." But Lena wasn't listening. She had heard the whisper. She had felt Elias's presence in the silence. It was enough. With a final, desperate push, Lena reached into the void. She tore through the fabric of the song, breaking free from the endless cycle, from the oppressive grip of the music. And in that moment, as the silence stretched before her, she felt the weight of her choice, the weight of the truth she had uncovered. The song had no end, but maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to finish it. The world around her shifted again, the figures dissolving into the distance. The woman's voice echoed one last time, but it was too late. The silence had already begun to stretch and twist, reforming into something new, something free. And Lena was finally free. Chapter 12, The Final Note. Lena stood alone in the vast, empty expanse. The world she had known was gone, swallowed by the silence she had fought to command. No voices lingered in the air, no oppressive hum of the choir. Just the endless, infinite space that stretched out before her, both freeing and isolating. The song was gone. Its echoes faded into nothingness. But in its place, something else had begun to stir. At first, she felt the weightlessness, as if her body had no ground beneath it. But slowly, imperceptibly, the world around her began to shift. It wasn't much, just a slight ripple in the fabric of this place, but it was enough to draw her attention. Lena took a cautious step forward. The ground, or what she assumed was ground, shifted beneath her, like stepping onto an unseen wave in the ocean. It didn't feel real, and yet it was. Her senses were still sharp, still aware of the absence of sound. But that silence, which had once seemed so terrifying, was now strangely peaceful. She thought of Elias. His name had been the final whisper, the last remnant of the song she had heard before breaking free. Had he found his way out of the void? Had he been part of her liberation? Or was he still trapped somewhere in the shadows of the music? She didn't know. And in this place, this new reality where nothing made sense, she wasn't sure it mattered. The silence had not been a victory. It had been a doorway, a door that led to something new, something that Lena couldn't yet understand, but could feel deep within her soul. The song had been a prison, yes, but it had also been the key. And the silence? The silence was both the end and the beginning. Her body moved on its own, propelled by some unseen force. She wasn't walking, exactly. It was more like drifting, like floating through the air. The sensation was strange, alien, but not unpleasant. The ripples in the space around her intensified, a soft, undulating pulse that mirrored the heartbeat she had longed to hear again. Is this freedom? Lena didn't know, but it felt like it. The oppressive weight of the song was gone. The constant pressure of the choir had lifted, and in its place, she felt a strange, almost intoxicating lightness. Her mind, once clouded with fear and confusion, now felt sharp, clear. The absence of sound of the song was like a balm, soothing the raw edges of her being. But then, the ripples in the silence began to shift. They weren't just waves anymore. They were patterns that began to take form. A figure appeared in the distance, a shadow on the edge of the nothingness. Lena's heart skipped a beat. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Elias. At first, she wasn't sure if it was him. The figure was hazy, distorted, as if it had been stretched too thin, torn between worlds. But as it moved closer, the form solidified, becoming more defined, more real. It was Elias. His face was different now, as if time had worn away at the edges of his features, leaving behind something ancient and worn. His eyes, though, were the same, dark, filled with the same intensity she remembered. But there was something else in them now, something she hadn't seen before. Sadness. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment, there was only the soft, pulsing silence between them. Lena opened her mouth, but no words came. She didn't need to speak. The silence had already said everything. Elias stepped forward, reaching for her. His hand hovered just above hers, as if afraid to touch her, as if afraid to break the fragile connection between them. "You did it," he said, his voice not a sound, but a presence, filling the air between them. It was not loud, not harsh, but it reverberated deep within her, filling the empty spaces inside. His voice was not the same as before. It was as though he had learned to speak through the silence, to communicate in ways that transcended words. Lena nodded, her own thoughts twisting as she tried to find something to say. Did she do it? Was it over? But Elias's face darkened. The smile that had lingered on his lips faded as his eyes dropped to the ground. He seemed to hesitate, as though he was struggling with something he couldn't quite articulate. The weight of his unspoken words was heavy, pressing on Lena's chest. "You've freed us," he continued, "but the cycle, it's not over." Lena's heart sank. The words were like ice water in her veins, chilling her to the core. The cycle? Not over, she thought, but no words passed through her lips. She was trapped in the space between them, unable to speak, unable to question. Elias stepped back, his gaze piercing. "The song," he said, "the song is still inside you." She felt it then, the thrum, the faint pulse of it, deep within her chest. It was a part of her now, like the rhythm of her own heartbeat. But this time, it wasn't oppressive. It wasn't a prison. It was alive, almost sentient, waiting for her to acknowledge it, to embrace it. "You're still a part of it," Elias said, his voice growing softer, the sadness in his eyes deepening. "And when you leave this place, it will follow you. The silence is not an escape, Lena. It's just another layer. And once you break through it," his voice trailed off, and he shook his head slowly, as though he couldn't finish what he had started to say. Lena felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Leave this place? What did that mean? Was there a way out of this world? Could they return to the world they once knew? Or was this their new reality? The place between the song and silence, forevermore? As if to answer her unspoken question, the ground beneath her began to shift again. The ripples in the silence thickened, coiling and spiraling outward, pulling her toward them. The edges of her vision blurred. "No," Elias said, stepping toward her, his hand reaching out to stop her. "You don't understand. You can't understand. Once you've heard the song, once you've felt it, it never leaves." You'll always hear it in the distance, in the silence, waiting to be called again. Lena felt the pull, the draw of the silence, of the song, like the beckoning of an old friend. It called to her, and though she wanted to resist, she couldn't. The pull was too strong. Her body, her mind, her very soul, everything about her was drawn to it. "I've made my choice," Lena whispered, though she didn't know who she was speaking to. Elias? The figures that lurked in the dark? The song itself? "This is where I belong." Elias stepped back, his face filled with sorrow, and as he did, Lena felt the first tremor of the song vibrate through her once more. But this time, it was not a prison. It was not a curse. It was a call, a final note, ringing in the distance, beckoning her home. Lena closed her eyes, allowing herself to listen to it. The choir, the music, the voices, it was all inside her. She had become one with it, and as the final, hollow note reverberated through her mind, she understood. She understood that the song would never truly end. It would always echo in the spaces between silence and sound. She was free, yes, but she was also forever bound to the rhythm of its endless pulse. And as the silence began to fill the space around her once more, Lena stepped forward into the unknown. The song would follow her, and she would follow it. It was the final note, but the song would never truly fade away.